Operation Paperclip, the Nazi scientists who built America's future. In the ashes of World War II, as the smoke of destruction faded over Europe, a new kind of war was already beginning, one fought not with bullets or bombs, but with brains. The United States and the Soviet Union both raced to seize the most valuable spoils of the war, the scientists of Nazi Germany. Men who had built the V-2 rockets, the nerve agents, and the jet engines that had terrorized Europe, and who now held the key to the future of warfare. This is the story of Operation Paperclip, the secret US program that brought over 1,600 Nazi scientists, engineers, and doctors to America. Some became heroes of science, others carried the stain of atrocity. Together they shaped the space race, the arms race, and the dawn of a new military age. Welcome to Secrets of the Battlefield. This is Operation Paperclip, the program that turned war criminals into national assets and forever blurred the line between victory and morality. Chapter 1. The Hunt for Nazi Scientists. When Nazi Germany collapsed in May 1945, the world thought the war was finally over. But beneath the rubble of the Third Reich, another kind of race began. A race for knowledge, technology, and the men who possessed it. Both the United States and the Soviet Union knew that the scientists of Hitler's regime had achieved things no one else in the world had. The V-2 rocket, the first human-made object to reach the edge of space. Jet aircraft far ahead of Allied technology. Chemical weapons capable of wiping out cities. And experimental research that, though horrific, had yielded data on human physiology, aviation, and extreme conditions. To the victors, these discoveries were priceless, and whoever controlled them would control the future. In the chaos of Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence units began tracking down these scientists. American officers, operating under the newly formed Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, scoured laboratories, bunkers, and bombed out research centers. They seized blueprints, prototypes, and most importantly, people. At the top of every list was Werner von Braun, the brilliant but controversial engineer behind the V-2 rocket program at Peenemünde. Von Braun and his team of rocket specialists had already begun surrendering to American forces, knowing that capture by the Soviets could mean imprisonment or worse. But they were not alone. Across Germany, the Soviets were conducting their own raids, storming research facilities, kidnapping engineers, and transporting them eastward. It wasn't just a scientific competition, it was a human hunt. Both sides justified their actions as national security. Both ignored the moral cost. And so, in the summer of 1945, Operation Paperclip was born, a secret US mission to recruit Nazi scientists and bring them to America under false identities. Officially, these men would be cleared of their war crimes. Unofficially, the United States was about to rewrite the past in the name of the future. Chapter 2. The Secret Transfers to America. In the months following Germany's surrender, Operation Paperclip moved from planning to execution. Its mission was simple, but ethically devastating: identify, extract, and relocate Nazi scientists before the Soviets could reach them. The US Army's Counterintelligence Corps and the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA, began collecting dossiers on hundreds of German researchers. Each profile was marked with a paperclip, symbolizing that the scientist was of special interest. That small metal clip would give the operation its infamous name. Publicly, the United States condemned Nazi atrocities. But behind closed doors, American intelligence officers were forging a different path, one where war crimes could be overlooked in exchange for knowledge. In the summer of 1945, under the codename Operation Overcast, the first groups of scientists were quietly moved from occupied Germany to a secret base in Bavaria. From there, they were flown to the United States, often under new names and forged histories. Most were sent to Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico, where they continued their work on rocketry for the U.S. Army. Others went to Wright Field in Ohio or naval research centers on the East Coast. The irony was staggering. Many of these men had built the weapons that once rained destruction on London. Now they were being paid by the U.S. government to develop missiles that could target Moscow. Among them was Arthur Rudolph, a key engineer from the V-2 program who later helped build the Saturn V rocket that sent Apollo astronauts to the moon. Another was Hubertus Strughold, who had overseen medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners and would later be celebrated as the father of space medicine. The moral compromise was total. The U.S. government's own War Crimes Office warned that several of these men were implicated in slavery, torture, or human experimentation. But President Truman's advisors insisted that the Soviet threat outweighed all ethical concerns. To protect the operation, the State Department simply erased or rewrote entire pasts. Nazi Party affiliations were removed from records. Photographs were altered. And when journalists asked questions, officials denied everything. By 1946, more than 700 scientists and engineers had been brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. They were given homes, jobs, and security clearances, while their victims were forgotten. What began as a temporary program soon became permanent. The men who once built Hitler's weapons were now helping America win the next war, the Cold War. Chapter 3. Building the Arsenal of the Cold War. By the late 1940s, Operation Paperclip scientists had become deeply embedded within America's new military-industrial complex. The same minds that once worked for Hitler were now the architects of America's post-war power, designing rockets, missiles, and technologies that would define the coming era. At White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, Werner von Braun and his rocket team began testing modified V-2 missiles under U.S. Army supervision. The data gathered from these tests became the foundation for America's ballistic missile program. Each launch brought lessons in flight control, guidance systems, and atmospheric re-entry, knowledge the United States had never possessed before. Von Braun's group wasn't just tolerated, they were celebrated. Photographs show smiling former Nazis standing beside U.S. generals, proudly posing with the rockets that had once devastated London. To the public, they were now German experts, not former members of the Nazi regime. Soon their work expanded beyond weapons. At Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, Paperclip scientists developed the Redstone and Jupiter missiles, early precursors to the intercontinental ballistic missile. These same designs would later evolve into the rockets that carried satellites and eventually humans into space. In parallel, others recruited under Paperclip contributed to America's chemical and biological weapons programs. Men like Kurt Blome, who had conducted plague experiments for the Nazis, were now advising the U.S. Army on germ warfare defense. In Texas, Hubertus Strughold began research on the effects of extreme altitude and oxygen deprivation, data originally obtained through lethal experiments in concentration camps. Within a few short years, the U.S. military had absorbed the technological brainpower of its former enemy. The Cold War demanded results, and these men delivered. Every rocket launch, every jet prototype, every nuclear delivery system had traces of Nazi engineering in its DNA. But there was a darker side. Many of the scientists lived comfortably in America, granted citizenship and honors, while Holocaust survivors and former prisoners still struggled to rebuild their lives. The very men who had benefited from forced labor and human suffering were now shaping the new frontier, space. By the mid-1950s, von Braun's team had moved to Huntsville, Alabama, where they began designing the Jupiter C rocket. In 1958, that rocket launched America's first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit. It marked the birth of the U.S. space program, a direct child of Operation Paperclip. To the world, it was a triumph of science. To history, it was a victory built on buried truths. Chapter 4. The Moral Reckoning. As the Cold War intensified, Operation Paperclip's success was celebrated as a triumph of American ingenuity. Rockets soared, satellites orbited, and the United States prepared to send men into space. But behind the polished headlines, a disturbing question lingered. What price had been paid for this progress? By the late 1950s, a new generation of journalists and historians began uncovering fragments of the truth. They found records of Nazi party memberships, SS affiliations, and testimonies from concentration camp survivors describing how some of these scientists had used slave labor or human test subjects in their experiments. Names that once appeared heroic now carried a shadow. Arthur Rudolph, praised for his work on the Saturn V rocket, was revealed to have overseen brutal forced labor at the Mittelwerk underground factory, where thousands of prisoners died building V-2 rockets. Hubertus Strughold, hailed as the father of space medicine, had been linked to experiments in Dachau, where victims were frozen or exposed to low pressure until death. The US government faced a moral paradox. Could scientific achievement erase moral guilt? Could the pursuit of knowledge justify collaboration with evil? For decades, the answer had been yes, as long as the results benefited national security. But public opinion began to change. The world that once saw these men as assets now saw them for what they were, products of a regime that had committed atrocities on an industrial scale. In the 1970s, investigative journalists and declassified documents finally exposed the full scale of Operation Paperclip. Congressional hearings revealed how American intelligence had deliberately falsified records, destroyed evidence, and ignored war crime warnings from its own investigators. The truth was undeniable. Operation Paperclip had shielded war criminals and rewarded them with new lives. When confronted, many officials defended their choices. They argued that if the United States hadn't taken these men, the Soviets would have, and that the Cold War left no room for moral hesitation. Arthur Rudolph was eventually stripped of his U.S. citizenship in 1984 and forced to return to Germany. Strughold died in 1986, still honored by some in NASA circles, though his legacy remains permanently tainted. For every success story there was a moral wound, a reminder that history's greatest leaps often come with a human cost. Operation Paperclip had given America the stars, but it had done so by ignoring the ashes beneath them. Chapter 5. The Legacy of Operation Paperclip. By the time the Cold War came to an end, Operation Paperclip had already reshaped the modern world. Its fingerprints could be found everywhere, in rockets that reached the moon, missiles that defined nuclear strategy, and laboratories that advanced medicine, aviation, and space exploration. For the United States, the program was an undeniable success. Wernher von Braun became a national icon, appearing on magazine covers, television programs, and even collaborating with Walt Disney to promote space travel. His Saturn V rocket carried Neil Armstrong to the moon in 1969, a moment that defined the 20th century. To most Americans, von Braun was the genius who made spaceflight possible. Few knew he had once worn an SS uniform. For decades, the story of Operation Paperclip remained buried under patriotic myth. It wasn't until documents were declassified in the 1980s and 1990s that the full truth came to light. The secret deals, the rewritten files, and the moral compromises that had made it all possible. Historians now see Paperclip as a symbol of the moral grey zone where science, politics, and survival collide. It demonstrated how quickly ideals can bend when nations are driven by fear, and how easily truth can be rewritten in the name of progress. But it also raises an uncomfortable question that still echoes today. Is it possible to separate scientific achievement from moral responsibility? The technologies born from Paperclip helped humanity reach space and build the foundation of the modern world. Yet they also emerged from a system built on suffering and exploitation. The same rocket that carried man to the moon was descended from a weapon that had killed civilians by the thousands. Operation Paperclip's legacy is not just one of innovation, it's a warning. It reminds us that power, knowledge, and ambition without conscience can lead humanity down the same path again. Science is never neutral. It reflects the hands and the ethics of those who wield it. In the end, the story of Operation Paperclip is the story of the 20th century itself, a race for power, a war for knowledge, and a fragile balance between brilliance and betrayal.